The balance of power is shifting, and America's global reputation is getting worse. Once seen as the world's leader, the US is now facing growing resentment from both allies and enemies. Countries that once stood with America now criticize it, while longtime rivals become more aggressive. But in which countries is this new wave of resistance taking place? These nations are distancing themselves from the US for a variety of reasons, including military conflicts, border disputes, and economic issues. Before we begin, like and subscribe, as today we are counting down the 10 countries that hate Americans the most in 2025 and exposing why their resentment is growing. 1. Mexico. Mexico's relationship with the US has always been complicated, but with Trump's return and his strict policies on trade and immigration, tensions are rising fast. His decision to reintroduce heavy tariffs on Mexican imports has infuriated Mexican officials, who rely on the American market. Yet, at the same time, Mexico continues to allow illegal immigration and drug smuggling across the border, showing little interest in helping America secure its sovereignty. Cartels operate freely, fueling both the U.S. fentanyl crisis and Mexico's own violent crime epidemic, yet the government refuses to take meaningful action. Meanwhile, anti-American sentiment grows in Mexico's media and political circles. America is seen as an oppressive, racist nation that must be resisted. Mexico benefits massively from U.S. trade, tourism, and investment, yet it refuses to address its corruption and economic instability. Trump's tariffs are only the beginning. Mexico's dependence on the U.S. will soon be tested, and their leaders may have to take responsibility for their own problems. 2. China. China has long been America's biggest economic and geopolitical rival, but in 2025, under Xi Jinping's rule, the hostility is now out in the open. Trump's tariffs have struck China hard, targeting industries that once relied on cheap access to U.S. markets. Beijing, desperate to maintain its economic grip, is retaliating with its own tariffs, driving an all-out trade war between the world's two largest economies. Militarily, China is more aggressive than ever, expanding its presence in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, and increasing its partnerships with anti-Western nations like Russia and Iran. But it's not just on the world stage that China opposes the West, it's in everyday life. The Chinese Communist Party has ramped up nationalist propaganda, teaching its citizens that the West, particularly the US, is an arrogant and declining power. Western companies operating in China are forced to comply with the regime's censorship laws, yet China demands full access to Western markets. With Trump taking a hard stance against China's economic abuse, Beijing is now seeking closer ties with Europe and the global South to replace its reliance on American trade. 3. Canada. Canada's status as a friendly neighbor is becoming more and more of an illusion. Canada has become a leading voice of progressive globalism, directly opposing conservative values in the West. Economically, Canada benefits from trade with the U.S. far more than the other way around, yet Trudeau has responded to Trump's new tariffs with outrage. And then there's energy. Trudeau's government has blocked or slowed crucial pipeline projects that could benefit both countries, choosing instead to double down on radical climate policies that weaken North American energy independence. Whether it's climate policies, mass migration, or social issues, Canada's government is constantly pushing an agenda that alienates conservative-leaning Westerners. Trudeau himself has taken repeated shots at leaders like Trump, portraying nationalist movements as dangerous and regressive. Culturally, anti-American sentiment has been rising in Canada, particularly among the younger generation. While Canada enjoys the security of being America's closest ally, it frequently criticizes U.S. policies and ridicules American culture. 4. Russia. Russia's animosity toward the West is no secret, but under Putin's continued leadership in 2025, that animosity has become a defining feature of its foreign policy. With the war in Ukraine still grinding on, Russia sees the US and its allies as direct threats, constantly blaming NATO for provoking conflicts. While some conservatives admire Russia's traditionalist stance on social issues, make no mistake, Putin views Western conservatism as just as much of an enemy as liberal globalism. Trump's approach to Russia has shifted drastically from his first term. With renewed military support for NATO and stricter sanctions, Moscow sees his leadership as a return to American strength. Yet Russia has adapted. It has built stronger economic ties with China and India, selling its oil at discounted rates while dodging Western sanctions. While Russia presents itself as a defender of national sovereignty, in reality, it seeks to expand its influence in Eastern Europe and beyond. It is working closely with anti-Western regimes, including Iran and North Korea, to create a new world order that directly opposes the West. 5. India. India is often seen as a natural ally of the West, especially given its tensions with China. But in reality, India's relationship with the West is far more self-serving than most people realize. While it enjoys massive trade benefits and military partnerships with the US and Europe, it refuses to take a firm stance against Russia or China. In recent times, India has embraced a more nationalist and independent approach to global affairs, often disregarding Western priorities when they don't align with its own. Trump's tariffs on Indian goods have added another layer of friction. India, once a major beneficiary of American outsourcing, is facing increasing scrutiny as the U.S. shifts focus toward domestic production. Yet, rather than adjusting, India has responded with its own protectionist policies, making it more difficult for Western companies to operate there. Meanwhile, India continues to buy Russian oil, defying Western sanctions and strengthening its strategic ties with Moscow. Culturally, India's rising nationalism has led to a stronger anti-Western sentiment among its population. While India remains a key player in global politics, its loyalty to the West is conditional at best, and as its economic and military power grows, it may distance itself even further from Western influence. 6. Iran. Iran has been an enemy of the West for decades, but in 2025, it's more aggressive than ever. Iran continues to fund and arm militant groups that threaten Western interests. Despite facing economic sanctions, Iran has strengthened its ties with China and Russia, forming a dangerous anti-Western alliance. Western leaders, particularly in Europe, have made weak attempts to revive the nuclear deal, but Iran has no interest in negotiating in good faith. Instead, it has ramped up its uranium enrichment, getting closer to developing nuclear weapons while its leaders make open threats against Israel and the U.S. Iran also plays a major role in fueling instability across the Middle East. From funding Hezbollah in Lebanon to supporting the Houthis in Yemen, the Iranian regime sees chaos as an opportunity to expand its influence. Meanwhile, its own people suffer under one of the most oppressive governments in the world, but any internal protest is crushed with brutal force. Iranian leaders blame all of their country's problems on the West, but in reality, Iran's suffering comes from its corrupt dictatorship. While Western nations debate whether to re-engage with Iran diplomatically, Tehran continues to plot ways to undermine and attack Western values, interests, and allies. 7. Germany. Germany may be part of NATO, but its relationship with the West is far from friendly. Germany has pursued policies that weaken the Western alliance while pretending to be a leader in Europe. Then there's the economy. Germany is the EU's powerhouse, but it doesn't play fair when it comes to trade. Trump's tariffs on European goods have reignited tensions, as Germany refuses to acknowledge its unfair trade practices. Meanwhile, German industries, once dominant, are struggling due to their misguided obsession with green energy policies that have made the country more reliant on foreign gas. Culturally, anti-Western sentiment is rising in Germany, particularly among its left-wing elite. German media and politicians often portray Americans and Brexit-supporting Brits as backwards. Meanwhile, Berlin continues to push globalist policies that undermine national identity and traditional values across Europe. For a country that relies on American military protection, Germany does very little to support its allies. 8. Turkey. Turkey is technically a NATO member, but under President Erdogan, it has become one of the most anti-Western countries in the alliance. Erdogan has positioned Turkey as a regional power that no longer follows Western interests, making deals with Russia, Iran, and China while undermining NATO's goals. One of Turkey's biggest betrayals was its purchase of Russian S-400 missile systems, which directly threaten NATO security. Despite repeated warnings from the West, Erdogan refused to back down, leading to U.S. sanctions. At the same time, Turkey still demands NATO protection whenever it suits its interests. Turkey also plays a double game in the Middle East. It also continues its aggressive policies in Syria, targeting US-backed Kurdish forces who played a crucial role in defeating ISIS. Erdogan uses nationalism and anti-Western rhetoric to maintain his grip on power, frequently blaming the US and Europe for Turkey's economic struggles. Beyond politics, Turkish society has seen a rise in anti-Western sentiment. State-controlled media promotes conspiracy theories about Western plots against Turkey, and many Turks believe that the West is trying to weaken their country. While Turkey still benefits from its NATO membership, it is increasingly acting like an adversary rather than an ally. 9. France. France has a long history of looking down on the rest of the world, and in 2025, that attitude is stronger than ever. While France presents itself as a Western power, it has become one of the most anti-Western voices within the West itself. French leaders constantly oppose US and British policies, positioning themselves as the moral leaders of Europe while failing to fix their own country's problems. One of the biggest areas of friction is trade. Trump's tariffs on European goods have caused outrage in France, where protectionist policies have always favored French businesses at the expense of fair competition. NATO is another important topic. France has been one of the loudest critics of the alliance. At the same time, France expects NATO protection while refusing to increase its own military spending. Culturally, French elites see the Anglo-American world as inferior. French media and politicians frequently mock conservative values, portraying the US and the UK as outdated societies clinging to nationalism. Meanwhile, France faces its own problems, including mass protests, economic stagnation, and rising crime, issues its government refuses to address while lecturing other nations on democracy and human rights. 10. South Korea, perhaps the most surprising country on this list. South Korea has seen a rapid rise in anti-Western sentiment, particularly among its younger generations. Despite decades of U.S. military protection, many South Koreans now view America as an unnecessary influence, with growing calls for the removal of U.S. troops from the peninsula. One major source of tension is South Korea's trade relationship with China. While South Korea has traditionally been a close American ally, it is now increasingly aligning itself with Beijing. South Korean businesses rely heavily on Chinese markets, and their government is hesitant to take a firm stance against China's aggression in the region. Meanwhile, South Korea expects American military support against North Korea while refusing to fully support U.S. strategies in Asia. Trump's renewed push for fair trade has also put pressure on South Korea, which has benefited from one-sided trade deals for years. Culturally, South Korea is distancing itself from Western values. Many younger Koreans believe their country no longer needs the US and that South Korea should take a more independent approach to global affairs. While South Korea remains a key US ally on paper, the reality is that the alliance is weakening.